Welcome, weary traveler, to another journey through the shadowed corridors of ancient history. If you found your way here tonight, perhaps you're seeking that gentle drift into slumber, carried along by the whispered secrets of civilizations long turned to dust. Or maybe you're simply curious about the darker chapters of our past, those stories that textbooks often gloss over with sanitized summaries. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me on this particular expedition, dear listener. Before we venture into the mysterious realm of ancient Babylon, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled under warm blankets as evening settles in? Or perhaps it's the early hours of morning where you are? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is for you right now. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing our little community of history enthusiasts spans the globe, all drawn together by these fascinating tales from antiquity. If you find yourself enchanted by these deep dives into history's most intriguing mysteries, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss our next adventure into the past. And now, let the stresses of the modern world melt away as we travel back over 4,000 years, to a time when the very air seemed thick with magic and menace, when gods walked among mortals, and when one city rose to become the most feared and revered metropolis the ancient world had ever known. Picture yourself standing on the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, between the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The sun beats down mercilessly on the baked earth, and in the distance, rising like a fever dream from the shimmering heat, you see it, Babylon. Even from miles away, its massive walls seem to scrape the very heavens, while strange, terraced towers pierce the sky like fingers reaching toward the realm of the gods. This is not just any ancient city. This is Babylon, a name that would echo through millennia, inspiring equal measures of awe and terror in all who heard it spoken. For over 2,000 years, this metropolis would stand as the beating heart of empire after empire, a place where the most brilliant minds gathered alongside the most ruthless rulers, where incredible beauty existed side by side with unimaginable cruelty. But what made Babylon so terrifying? What dark secrets lay hidden behind those towering walls? What practices and beliefs turned this center of learning and culture into something that would haunt the nightmares of its enemies for generations? Tonight, we'll uncover the chilling truth about why ancient Babylon wasn't just powerful or impressive, but genuinely, bone-deep, terrifying. As we delve into this story, we'll discover how Babylon's terror wasn't born from crude brutality alone, though there was certainly plenty of that. No, what made Babylon truly frightening was its sophisticated approach to domination, its systematic methods of psychological warfare, and its ability to make entire populations disappear, not just physically, but culturally and spiritually as well. We'll explore the dark religious practices that took place within those sacred ziggurats, rituals so disturbing that even hardened ancient warriors would speak of them only in whispers. We'll uncover the ingenious yet horrifying methods Babylonian rulers used to break the will of conquered peoples, and we'll examine how this ancient empire perfected the art of making its enemies fear not just defeat, but complete obliteration of their very identity. The story of Babylon's terror begins not with conquest, but with genius. For you see, the Babylonians understood something that many other ancient powers missed entirely. True domination comes not from the sword alone, but from the mind. They were master psychologists before psychology even had a name. Architects of fear who could dismantle a civilization's spirit as efficiently as their armies could tear down its walls. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand why Babylon became such a source of terror, we must first journey back to its humble beginnings, to a time when it was nothing more than a small settlement along the banks of the Euphrates River. The transformation of this modest town into history's most feared empire is a story that spans millennia, filled with brilliant innovations, ruthless ambition, and practices so dark they seem to belong more in the realm of nightmare than historical fact. So settle in, dear listener, as we begin our exploration of ancient Babylon's terrifying legacy. Let the distant past wash over you like a gentle tide, carrying you back to an age when the line between civilization and savagery was razor thin, and when one city's quest for dominance would reshape the ancient world forever. The tale begins around 2300 BCE, in the early Bronze Age, when the first settlements began to cluster around what would eventually become Babylon. The location was chosen with careful deliberation, positioned strategically where ancient trade routes converged along the fertile riverbanks. But even in these earliest days, there were signs that this place would be different from other cities, hints of the darkness that would eventually define its character. The name Babylon itself carries an ominous weight. In the Akkadian language, it was called Babilim, meaning gate of the gods. But what kind of gods required such a gate? And what lay beyond that threshold that mortals were so eager yet so terrified to glimpse? As we'll discover, the Babylonians developed a relationship with their deities that was far more complex and disturbing than the simple worship practiced by many of their contemporaries. From its earliest days, Babylon was a city of contradictions. It attracted the greatest scholars and scribes of the ancient world, men who developed the first written legal codes and made groundbreaking advances in mathematics and astronomy. Yet these same brilliant minds also devised methods of psychological manipulation and cultural destruction that would make modern dictators envious. The city's rise to power wasn't achieved through military might alone, though Babylonian armies were certainly formidable. Instead, Babylon's rulers understood that lasting dominance required something far more insidious: the ability to make conquered peoples want to surrender not just their lives, but their very souls to Babylonian authority. This psychological approach to conquest manifested in numerous terrifying ways. When Babylonian armies approached a city, they didn't simply lay siege to its walls. Instead, they would first send envoys bearing detailed accounts of what had happened to previous cities that had dared to resist. These weren't mere threats, but carefully crafted psychological warfare designed to plant seeds of despair in the defenders' minds long before the first arrow was fired. The envoys would describe in vivid detail how entire populations had been systematically relocated thousands of miles from their homelands, separated from their families, and forced to adopt Babylonian customs and religious practices. They would speak of how the very names of conquered cities had been erased from official records, their histories rewritten to glorify Babylonian rule, their gods transformed into mere servants of Babylon's supreme deity, Marduk. But perhaps most terrifying of all, these envoys would explain how resistance wasn't just futile, but actually counterproductive. They would describe how cities that surrendered immediately were often treated with relative mercy, their populations incorporated into the Babylonian system with some degree of dignity intact. However, those who dared to resist faced something far worse than death: complete obliteration of their cultural identity. This wasn't an empty threat. The Babylonians had perfected what we might today call cultural genocide, a systematic process of erasing entire civilizations from the face of the earth. When they conquered a resistant city, they didn't simply kill its inhabitants or enslave them. Instead, they would carefully dismantle every aspect of the conquered culture piece by piece, until nothing remained but a vague memory. The process began with the physical destruction of all religious sites and cultural monuments. Temples were torn down stone by stone, their sacred objects melted down or repurposed for Babylonian use. Libraries were burned, artwork destroyed, and any physical reminder of the conquered civilization's achievements systematically eliminated. But the Babylonians understood that destroying buildings and artifacts wasn't enough. To truly erase a culture, they had to attack its living heart, its people and their memories. This is where their methods became truly terrifying. Conquered populations were forcibly relocated in a process the Babylonians called scattering. Families were deliberately separated and sent to different corners of the empire, ensuring that children would grow up isolated from their cultural roots. Adults were assigned to work gangs where they were forbidden from speaking their native language, practicing their traditional customs, or even mentioning their homeland's name. Over time, usually within a single generation, these displaced peoples would lose all connection to their original culture. Their children would grow up speaking Akkadian, worshipping Babylonian gods, and thinking of themselves as Babylonians. The conquered civilization would effectively vanish, not through mass murder, but through a kind of cultural alchemy that transformed enemies into citizens. This systematic approach to cultural destruction was so effective that entire nations simply disappeared from history. The Babylonians didn't just conquer territory, they conquered memory itself, rewriting the past to serve their present needs. They became masters of what we might today call soft power, understanding that true dominance came not from inspiring fear alone, but from making resistance seem not just impossible, but unthinkable. Yet for all their psychological sophistication, the Babylonians were not above using more traditional forms of terror when the situation called for it. Their armies were renowned for their brutality, and Babylonian kings took pride in devising creative and horrifying punishments for those who defied their authority. Public executions in Babylon weren't simply about ending lives. They were elaborate theatrical productions designed to demonstrate the absolute power of the state. Condemned prisoners would be subjected to tortures that could last for days, their suffering displayed prominently in the city's main squares, as a reminder to all citizens of the consequences of disobedience. The Babylonians were particularly fond of symbolic punishments that reflected the nature of a prisoner's crimes. Thieves might have their hands slowly crushed with stone weights, while those who spoke against the king could have their tongues removed with red-hot pincers. But these physical torments were only the beginning. The true horror lay in what came next. The families of executed criminals were often forced to witness these punishments, then required to participate in the disposal of the bodies. Children were made to watch as their parents' remains were fed to wild animals or thrown into the city's sewage systems. This wasn't merely cruelty for its own sake, but a calculated method of ensuring that the trauma of witnessing such events would be passed down through generations, creating a population that lived in constant fear of state authority. This fear wasn't confined to criminals and their families. Every citizen of Babylon lived under the shadow of a surveillance system that would impress even modern totalitarian regimes. The city was divided into districts, each overseen by officials whose primary responsibility was monitoring the loyalty and behavior of residents. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious activities, and children were taught to inform on their own parents if they heard any criticism of the king or the state. The result was a society where genuine trust became almost impossible. People learned to watch their words carefully, to hide their true thoughts behind masks of public conformity, and to view every interaction as potentially dangerous. This atmosphere of paranoia and mutual suspicion served Babylon's rulers well, as it made organized resistance virtually impossible. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Babylonian society wasn't its political oppression or military might, but its religious practices. The Babylonians worshipped a pantheon of gods who were believed to be actively involved in human affairs, but these weren't benevolent deities who offered comfort and guidance to their followers. Instead, Babylonian gods were capricious, demanding, and often cruel entities who required constant appeasement through increasingly elaborate and disturbing rituals. At the center of Babylonian religious life stood the great ziggurat of Marduk, a massive stepped pyramid that dominated the city's skyline. This wasn't simply a temple, but a cosmic axis where heaven and earth were believed to intersect. Within its shadowed chambers, priests performed rituals that were said to maintain the very fabric of reality itself. But what exactly took place within those sacred walls? What ceremonies were so important that they required the participation of the entire city, yet so disturbing that detailed accounts were forbidden to be recorded? As we'll discover, the religious practices of ancient Babylon involved sacrifices and rituals that went far beyond anything practiced by their contemporaries, ceremonies that seemed designed not just to honor the gods, but to terrify the human participants into absolute submission. The answers to these questions lie hidden in the fragments of ancient texts that have survived to our time, written in cuneiform script on clay tablets that were buried for millennia before archaeologists brought them back to the light. What these documents reveal about Babylonian religious practices is both fascinating and deeply disturbing, offering us a glimpse into a worldview so alien to our modern sensibilities that it can be difficult to accept that such beliefs were once held by one of history's most advanced civilizations. But that exploration will have to wait for our next journey together, dear listener. For now, let these images of ancient Babylon settle in your mind like dust on forgotten ruins. Picture those towering walls rising from the desert sands. Imagine the sounds of a great city going about its daily business, and consider how a place of such learning and culture could simultaneously become a byword for terror that would echo through the ages. Rest well, knowing that we've only begun to scratch the surface of Babylon's dark secrets. In our next expedition into the past, we'll venture deeper into the heart of this ancient empire, exploring the religious practices that made even hardened warriors tremble, and uncovering the truth about why Babylon's very name became synonymous with everything that was most feared and forbidden in the ancient world. The heart of Babylonian terror lay not in what could be seen from those imposing walls, but in what remained hidden from view, whispered about in the darkened corners of ancient taverns, and recorded only in the most secret of texts. As we venture deeper into this realm of shadows and secrets, we must prepare ourselves for revelations that challenge our very understanding of what ancient civilizations were capable of. Let us begin with the most disturbing aspect of Babylonian society, their approach to childhood and education. While other ancient cultures certainly had their harsh practices regarding the young, the Babylonians developed a systematic method of psychological conditioning that began virtually from birth. Children in Babylon weren't simply educated, they were methodically reshaped into instruments of the state's will. From the earliest age, Babylonian children were separated into different categories based on their perceived usefulness to the empire. Those deemed suitable for administrative roles were taken from their families at the age of 5 and placed in specialized schools, where they would spend the next decade learning not just reading and mathematics, but the subtle arts of manipulation and control. These weren't mere academic institutions, but psychological laboratories where young minds were carefully molded to serve the empire's darker purposes. The curriculum in these schools would seem innocuous enough at first glance. Students learned to read and write in multiple languages, studied astronomy and mathematics, and memorized the great epic poems of their culture. But woven throughout these seemingly innocent lessons were more sinister teachings. Children were taught to identify signs of disloyalty in others, to recognize the subtle indicators that might suggest someone was harboring rebellious thoughts. They learned techniques for extracting information from unwilling subjects, methods that relied not on physical torture, but on psychological pressure so subtle and persistent that victims would often confess to crimes they hadn't committed simply to make the questioning stop. These young students practiced these techniques on each other, creating an environment where trust became impossible and paranoia was cultivated as a valuable survival skill. Perhaps most disturbing of all, these children were taught to view compassion and mercy as weaknesses to be exploited rather than virtues to be admired. They learned to identify emotional vulnerabilities in others and to use those weaknesses as tools for manipulation. By the time they graduated from these institutions, they had been transformed into something barely recognizable as human. Creatures who could smile warmly while plotting someone's destruction, who could offer comfort with one hand while wielding a knife with the other. Those children, not selected for administrative training, faced a different but equally disturbing fate. They were placed in what the Babylonians euphemistically called labor schools, institutions that were essentially factories for producing broken human beings. Here, children as young as 6 were subjected to back-breaking physical labor combined with psychological abuse, designed to crush any spark of independence or creativity they might possess. The goal wasn't simply to produce workers, but to create a class of people so thoroughly defeated that they would never even consider rebellion. These children were taught that suffering was their natural state, that questioning authority was not just wrong but literally impossible. They were conditioned to find comfort only in absolute obedience, to feel genuine terror at the thought of making any decision without explicit permission from their superiors. The methods used to achieve this psychological destruction were remarkably sophisticated. Children were kept in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when they might be rewarded or punished, never able to predict which behaviors would bring approval and which would result in pain. This unpredictability created a kind of learned helplessness that persisted throughout their entire lives. They were also subjected to what we might today recognize as sophisticated forms of gaslighting. Their memories were constantly questioned and contradicted, their perceptions dismissed as unreliable, their emotions treated as evidence of mental weakness. Over time, these children learned to distrust their own thoughts and feelings, becoming entirely dependent on external authority to tell them what was real and what was not. But the true genius of the Babylonian system lay in how it convinced these broken individuals that their suffering was not only necessary, but noble. They were taught elaborate mythologies that portrayed their pain as a sacred offering to the gods, their submission as a cosmic duty that maintained the order of the universe itself. By the time they reached adulthood, many of these victims had become so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would willingly inflict the same suffering on their own children, seeing it as an act of love rather than abuse. The effects of this systematic psychological manipulation extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire generations grew up in an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where genuine human connection became almost impossible. Families learned to hide their true feelings from each other. Friends became potential informants, and romantic relationships were poisoned by the constant fear that intimate confidences might be used as weapons. This emotional isolation served Babylon's rulers perfectly, as a population that couldn't trust each other could never organize effective resistance. People became so focused on protecting themselves from immediate threats that they lost sight of the larger system that was oppressing them all. It was a masterpiece of social engineering that kept the empire stable for centuries, while simultaneously destroying the humanity of everyone trapped within it. The religious dimension of Babylonian terror deserves special attention, as it reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspects of this ancient civilization. While we've touched on the ziggurat of Marduk and its mysterious rituals, the full scope of Babylonian religious practice extended far beyond any single temple or ceremony. Religion in Babylon wasn't simply a matter of personal faith or community worship. It was a comprehensive system of psychological control that penetrated every aspect of daily life. The Babylonian pantheon was carefully structured to reflect and reinforce the empire's political hierarchy. At the top stood Marduk, the supreme deity whose will was considered absolute and unquestionable. Below him were arranged dozens of lesser gods, each with specific roles and responsibilities that mirrored the bureaucratic structure of the earthly government. This wasn't accidental. The entire religious system was designed to make divine authority and political authority appear identical and equally unquestionable. But the true terror of Babylonian religion lay not in its political implications, but in its practical requirements. The gods of Babylon were portrayed as beings of infinite hunger and insatiable appetite, creatures who demanded constant feeding through elaborate sacrificial rituals. These weren't the relatively simple offerings of grain or livestock practiced by other ancient cultures, but complex ceremonies that required increasingly extreme forms of devotion. The priests who oversaw these rituals were among the most feared individuals in Babylonian society, not because of any political power they wielded, but because of the psychological techniques they employed to maintain their authority. They claimed to possess secret knowledge that allowed them to communicate directly with the gods, to interpret divine will, and to predict the cosmic consequences of human actions. This supposed divine communication always seemed to result in demands for more elaborate sacrifices, more complete submission, and more absolute obedience to religious authority. Those who questioned these demands were told they were risking not just their own spiritual welfare, but the stability of the entire cosmos. The priests described in vivid detail the catastrophes that would befall the city if the gods were not properly appeased, creating a climate of terror that made resistance seem not just dangerous, but cosmically irresponsible. The actual content of these sacrificial rituals was kept secret from the general population, known only to the highest-ranking priests and the royal family. But fragments of ancient texts suggest that these ceremonies involved practices so disturbing that even hardened ancient warriors would speak of them only in whispers. References survive to rituals involving the systematic torture of prisoners, ceremonies where victims were kept alive for days while being slowly dismembered, and rites that required participants to consume human flesh as a form of communion with the gods. These practices weren't aberrations or temporary excesses, but fundamental aspects of Babylonian religious life that continued for centuries. They were justified through elaborate theological arguments that portrayed such extreme devotion as necessary for maintaining cosmic order. The priests taught that the gods required these extreme sacrifices because they were locked in an eternal battle against forces of chaos that constantly threatened to destroy the universe. According to this worldview, every act of mercy, every moment of compassion, every gesture of human kindness weakened the cosmic barriers that kept chaos at bay. Only through absolute ruthlessness, complete submission to divine authority, and willingness to inflict unlimited suffering could the forces of order maintain their precarious victory over primordial darkness. This theological framework provided religious justification for every atrocity committed by Babylonian authorities. Political prisoners weren't simply being punished for their crimes, they were being offered as necessary sacrifices to maintain universal stability. Conquered populations weren't merely being subjugated, they were being incorporated into a cosmic order that required their complete submission. Even the psychological torture of children was portrayed as a sacred duty, a way of preparing young souls for their role in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The genius of this system lay in how it transformed perpetrators into victims in their own minds. Those who carried out these atrocities weren't monsters, they believed, but reluctant servants of cosmic necessity. They had been chosen by the gods to bear the terrible burden of maintaining universal order, and their willingness to inflict suffering demonstrated their spiritual strength rather than their moral corruption. This psychological transformation was so complete that many Babylonian officials genuinely believed They were performing acts of compassion when they ordered mass executions or authorized the torture of prisoners. They saw themselves as physicians treating a diseased body politic, surgeons cutting away infected flesh to save the larger organism. The fact that this treatment involved unimaginable suffering for their victims was simply evidence of how serious the spiritual disease had become. The long-term effects of this religious conditioning extended far beyond Babylon's borders and far beyond its historical existence. The psychological techniques developed by Babylonian priests were passed down through successive civilizations, evolving and adapting, but never entirely disappearing. Elements of Babylonian thought can be traced through Persian, Greek, and Roman cultures, and some scholars argue that echoes of these ancient practices can still be found in modern totalitarian movements. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Babylonian religious terror was its impact on how subsequent cultures understood the relationship between divine authority and human suffering. The Babylonian model established a template for using religious belief as a tool of political control, for transforming spiritual devotion into an instrument of oppression, and for convincing populations that their suffering was not only necessary, but sacred. This template would be refined and adapted by countless later civilizations, each adding their own innovations while preserving the core insight that true power comes not from controlling bodies, but from controlling minds and souls. The Babylonians understood that physical force alone could never create lasting dominance. Only by convincing people that their submission was cosmically necessary could rulers achieve the kind of absolute authority that Babylon maintained for over 2 millennia. As we contemplate these revelations about ancient Babylonian society, it's important to remember that we're not simply examining historical curiosities or academic abstractions. These were real people who lived and suffered and died under this system, human beings whose experiences were shaped by the psychological techniques we've been discussing. Their pain was genuine, their fear was rational, and their inability to escape or resist was the product of one of history's most sophisticated systems of mental and spiritual control. The fact that such a system could persist for so long, that it could produce remarkable achievements in art and science while simultaneously inflicting unimaginable suffering on millions of people, should serve as a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for both brilliance and horror. The Babylonians weren't monsters from some alien species. They were humans like ourselves, possessed of the same potential for both creation and destruction that exists within all of us. This recognition makes their story not just historically fascinating, but personally relevant. The techniques they developed for controlling human behavior, the methods they used to break down resistance and reshape personalities, the psychological insights they gained through centuries of experimentation on unwilling subjects. These tools haven't disappeared from the world. They've simply been refined, modernized, and adapted for contemporary use. Understanding how the Babylonians achieved their dominance over human minds and spirits isn't just an exercise in historical analysis. It's a form of psychological self-defense. By recognizing these patterns, by understanding how systematic manipulation works, we become better equipped to resist such techniques when we encounter them in our own lives and times. The story of Babylon serves as both a warning and a guide, showing us what becomes possible when human beings surrender their capacity for independent thought and moral judgment to external authority. It demonstrates how quickly and completely a civilization can transform from a center of learning and culture into an engine of oppression and terror, and how that transformation can occur so gradually that those living through it barely notice what's happening until it's too late to resist. But Babylon's terror wasn't limited to its treatment of its own citizens or even its conquered enemies. The empire also developed sophisticated methods for extending its influence far beyond its borders, creating networks of fear and dependency that stretched across the known world. Through a combination of diplomatic manipulation, economic coercion, and psychological warfare, Babylonian rulers managed to exercise control over nations they had never actually conquered, peoples who remained technically independent while being effectively enslaved to Babylonian interests. This network of terror began with Babylon's mastery of what we might today call economic warfare. The Babylonians understood that military conquest, while effective, was also expensive and time-consuming. Far more efficient was the gradual process of making other nations dependent on Babylonian trade, then slowly tightening that dependency until it became indistinguishable from slavery. The process would begin innocuously enough. Babylonian merchants would arrive in foreign cities bearing exotic goods and offering favorable trade agreements. They brought spices from distant lands, fine textiles woven by master craftsmen, and metal tools of superior quality to anything the local population could produce. These merchants seemed generous, almost philanthropic, offering their wares at prices so low that local artisans couldn't compete. Within a few years, entire industries in these foreign cities would collapse. Why struggle to weave rough cloth when Babylonian textiles were available for a fraction of the cost? Why maintain the difficult art of metalworking when Babylonian tools were both cheaper and better? The local population would gradually abandon their traditional crafts, becoming entirely dependent on Babylonian imports for their basic needs. Once this dependency was established, the true nature of Babylonian generosity would slowly reveal itself. Prices would begin to rise, but so gradually that each increase seemed reasonable. Quality would start to decline, but never quite enough to make local production seem viable again. Most insidiously, the Babylonians would begin to demand payment not just in gold or silver, but in more personal forms of tribute. They might request that promising young people from the dependent city be sent to Babylon for educational opportunities. These students would indeed receive excellent training in Babylonian methods and thinking, but they would also be thoroughly indoctrinated with Babylonian values and loyalty. When they returned home, they would serve as agents of Babylonian influence, gradually reshaping their native culture to align with Babylonian interests. The Babylonians might also begin to require that local religious practices be modified to acknowledge Babylonian gods. This would be presented not as conquest, but as theological enlightenment, an opportunity for the local population to participate in a more sophisticated understanding of divine truth. Resistance to these improvements would be met not with military force, but with economic pressure. Trade agreements would be renegotiated, prices would rise, and essential goods would become mysteriously scarce until the local population agreed to the requested changes. Over time, these seemingly independent cities would find themselves transformed into virtual colonies of Babylon, their economies controlled by Babylonian merchants, their young people educated in Babylonian schools, their religious practices overseen by Babylonian priests, and their political decisions influenced by Babylonian advisors. The local population would retain the illusion of independence while being effectively enslaved to Babylonian interests. This process was so gradual and so seemingly beneficial in its early stages that most populations never realized what was happening until it was far too late to resist. By the time they understood the true nature of their situation, they had become so dependent on Babylonian support that rebellion would mean economic collapse and social chaos. They were trapped in a web of dependency that had been woven around them so skillfully that they had helped to create their own chains. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. People who'd considered themselves free citizens of independent cities suddenly understood that they were little more than slaves, that their apparent prosperity was entirely dependent on the whims of foreign masters, and that their children's futures were being shaped by alien values and priorities. The sense of helplessness and despair that accompanied this recognition often led to complete psychological collapse, making resistance even more unlikely. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this system was how it corrupted those who administered it. The local officials, who had been co-opted into serving Babylonian interests, often experienced a form of psychological splitting that allowed them to maintain their self-image as patriots, while simultaneously betraying their own people. They would convince themselves that collaboration was actually a form of resistance, that by working within the system, they were protecting their communities from worse fates. These collaborators would develop elaborate justifications for their actions, creating complex moral frameworks that portrayed submission to Babylon as a form of wisdom rather than cowardice. They would point to the material benefits that Babylonian rule had brought, the roads and aqueducts and public buildings that had been constructed with Babylonian support. They would argue that resistance was not only futile, but actually harmful to their own people, that those who opposed Babylonian influence were dangerous radicals who threatened the stability and prosperity of the community. The most successful of these collaborators would eventually come to genuinely believe their own propaganda, transforming from reluctant servants into enthusiastic advocates of Babylonian rule. They would begin to see their own culture as primitive and backward compared to the sophisticated civilization of their masters. They would feel genuine gratitude toward the Babylonians for enlightening them, genuine shame for their people's resistance to such obvious improvements. This psychological transformation was so complete that many of these collaborators would become more zealous in enforcing Babylonian authority than the Babylonians themselves. They would identify potential troublemakers in their own communities and report them to Babylonian authorities. They would advocate for even more complete integration with Babylonian systems. They would work tirelessly to convince their neighbors that resistance was not only hopeless, but morally wrong. The children of these collaborators often faced an even more complex psychological burden. Raised in households where loyalty to Babylon was portrayed as a virtue, while connection to their ancestral culture was treated as a source of shame, they would grow up feeling fundamentally alienated from their own heritage. They would speak their native language with accents influenced by Babylonian pronunciation, practice their traditional customs with modifications designed to make them more acceptable to Babylonian sensibilities, and view their own history through lenses provided by Babylonian education. Many of these children would eventually migrate to Babylon itself, seeking to escape the psychological confusion of their hybrid existence by fully embracing their conqueror's culture. They would change their names to Babylonian versions, adopt Babylonian dress and customs, and work harder than native-born Babylonians to prove their loyalty and worth. Yet, they would never quite belong, remaining forever marked as foreigners despite their desperate attempts at assimilation. The Babylonians were well aware of this psychological dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. They would deliberately promote these cultural converts to positions of authority over their native populations, knowing that the converts' desperate need to prove their loyalty would make them particularly harsh in suppressing any signs of resistance. They would be given responsibility for implementing the most oppressive policies, creating a situation where the conquered peoples were literally oppressed by their own transformed kinsmen. This strategy served multiple purposes for Babylonian rulers. It made resistance more difficult by dividing communities against themselves, creating internal conflicts that prevented unified opposition. It also provided a form of psychological protection for the Babylonians themselves, allowing them to maintain that they were not oppressors but liberators, that any harsh measures were actually being implemented by local authorities who understood their own people's needs better than outsiders could. Most importantly, this system created a self-perpetuating cycle of psychological domination that could continue even without direct Babylonian oversight. Once a sufficient number of local people had been converted to Babylonian thinking, they would continue to enforce Babylonian values and suppress resistance even if Babylonian authorities were absent. The conquered population would effectively police itself, maintaining their own subjugation through internalized fear and shame. The long-term effects of this psychological colonization extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire cultures would gradually lose their distinctive characteristics, their languages corrupted by Babylonian loanwords, their art influenced by Babylonian aesthetics, their religious practices modified to accommodate Babylonian theological concepts. Over the course of generations, these cultures would become pale shadows of their former selves, retaining only superficial elements of their original identity while being fundamentally transformed into variants of Babylonian civilization. This cultural transformation was so thorough that many of these conquered peoples would eventually forget that they had ever been independent, that their ancestors had once possessed their own unique traditions and values. They would come to believe that their current hybrid culture was their authentic heritage, that any stories of pre-Babylonian independence were myths or propaganda created by troublemakers seeking to destabilize their peaceful integration into the Babylonian world order. The Babylonians encouraged this historical amnesia through systematic destruction of records and monuments that might remind conquered peoples of their independent past. Libraries were purged of texts that contradicted Babylonian historical narratives. Oral traditions were suppressed through legal penalties and social pressure, and physical artifacts that might serve as reminders of pre-conquest culture were either destroyed or reinterpreted to support Babylonian claims of historical continuity. In place of these authentic historical records, the Babylonians would provide new histories that portrayed their conquest not as an invasion, but as a liberation, not as the destruction of independent cultures, but as the enlightenment of backward peoples who had been struggling in darkness until Babylonian wisdom showed them the path to civilization. These revised histories would become the official truth, taught in schools, proclaimed in temples, and repeated until even the descendants of the conquered peoples came to believe them. The psychological techniques developed through this process of cultural conquest would prove to be Babylon's most enduring legacy. Long after the empire's military power had faded, long after its great cities had crumbled into ruins, the methods it had pioneered for controlling human minds and reshaping human cultures would continue to influence subsequent civilizations. Every empire that followed would study Babylonian techniques and adapt them for their own use, refining and modernizing these ancient tools of psychological domination. But the true horror of the Babylonian system lay not just in its effectiveness, but in its apparent invisibility to those trapped within it. The victims of Babylonian psychological manipulation often never realized what had been done to them, never understood that their thoughts and feelings and values had been systematically reshaped to serve foreign interests. They would live their entire lives believing that they were free, while being more thoroughly enslaved than any physical captive. This invisibility was achieved through the gradual nature of the process and through the Babylonian skill at making their manipulations appear to be natural developments or personal choices. People would be convinced that they were adopting Babylonian customs because those customs were obviously superior, that they were accepting Babylonian values because those values were demonstrably true, that they were serving Babylonian interests because those interests aligned with their own genuine desires. The genius of this approach was that it created willing slaves who would defend their enslavement as freedom, who would attack anyone who suggested that they were being manipulated, and who would work tirelessly to extend the same system of control to others. They became not just victims, but active agents of their own oppression, missionaries of psychological slavery, who spread Babylonian influence more effectively than any army could have done. As we drift deeper into this exploration of ancient terror, let these images settle in your mind like sediment in still water. Picture the careful orchestration of conquest, not through sword and fire alone, but through the subtle reshaping of human souls. Consider how an empire could achieve dominance not by destroying its enemies, but by transforming them into willing servants who would mistake their servitude for salvation. The night grows deeper around us, dear listener, and there are still darker chambers in Babylon's legacy waiting to be explored. But for now, let your thoughts wander through these shadowed corridors of the past, where the line between civilization and savagery was not just crossed, but systematically erased, where the very concepts of freedom and identity were weapons to be wielded by those who understood the deepest vulnerabilities of the human spirit. The shadows deepen as we venture into perhaps the most chilling aspect of Babylonian terror, their mastery of what we might call temporal warfare, the systematic destruction of time itself as a concept that could provide comfort or hope to their subjects. For the Babylonians understood something that few other ancient powers grasped, that human beings derive much of their strength from their connection to both past and future, from the stories that give meaning to their present suffering and the dreams that make endurance worthwhile. To break this source of spiritual resistance, Babylonian authorities developed techniques for severing these temporal connections, trapping entire populations in an eternal present where neither memory nor hope could provide refuge from immediate oppression. This wasn't simply a matter of destroying historical records or suppressing future planning. It was a comprehensive assault on the human experience of time itself. The process began with what the Babylonians termed calendar reformation. When they conquered a new territory, one of their first acts would be to impose a new system for measuring and marking time. The conquered people's traditional festivals would be abolished or transformed beyond recognition, their seasonal celebrations replaced with Babylonian observances, their methods of tracking years and months supplanted by Babylonian chronologies. This might seem like a merely administrative change, but its psychological impact was profound. The old calendar had been woven into the fabric of daily life, marking not just the passage of days, but the rhythm of meaning itself. Harvest festivals connected people to the land and to generations of ancestors who had worked the same soil. Religious observances provided touchstones of spiritual significance that helped individuals understand their place in a larger cosmic order. Even simple markers, like market days and rest periods, created a sense of predictable structure that made life feel manageable and comprehensible. When this temporal framework was suddenly swept away and replaced with an alien system, people experienced a form of chronological vertigo that left them disoriented and psychologically vulnerable. They no longer knew when to plant or when to celebrate, when to mourn or when to rejoice. The natural rhythms that had guided their ancestors for countless generations became irrelevant overnight, replaced by artificial markers that felt arbitrary and meaningless. But the Babylonians didn't stop with mere calendar reform. They also implemented what we might call memory management, a systematic campaign to alter not just how people remembered the past, but what they were permitted to remember at all. This began with the suppression of certain types of stories and songs, particularly those that celebrated pre-conquest heroes or depicted resistance to foreign rule as noble or worthwhile. Professional storytellers and musicians found themselves subject to increasingly strict regulations about what tales they could tell and what songs they could sing. Those who violated these restrictions faced not just legal penalties, but social ostracism, as communities learned to fear association with anyone who might be considered a troublemaker. Over time, entire genres of traditional narrative simply disappeared, their preservation too dangerous for anyone to attempt. In place of these suppressed stories, Babylonian authorities encouraged the development of new narratives that served their interests. These weren't crude propaganda pieces, but sophisticated works of art that presented Babylonian rule as the natural and beneficial culmination of historical progress. They told stories of chaos and suffering that had existed before Babylonian intervention, of wise and benevolent rulers who who had brought order and prosperity to grateful populations. The most insidious aspect of these replacement narratives was how they appropriated and transformed elements of authentic local tradition. Babylonian storytellers would take beloved heroes from conquered cultures and retell their stories in ways that made them servants or allies of Babylonian power. They would present ancient victories as early examples of Babylonian influence, suggesting that their subjects' ancestors had always been part of the Babylonian sphere, even when they thought they were independent. These revised histories were crafted with such skill that they often seemed more compelling and coherent than the fragmented authentic traditions they replaced. They provided clear explanations for complex historical events, offered satisfying moral lessons about the rewards of cooperation and the dangers of resistance, and presented a vision of the future that seemed both inevitable and desirable. Children who grew up hearing these stories would naturally assume they were true, and even adults who remembered the original versions would begin to doubt their own memories when confronted with such polished and persuasive alternatives. The human mind's tendency to prefer coherent narratives over fragmentary memories made people vulnerable to accepting these fabrications, especially when believing them offered social advantages, while questioning them brought danger. The assault on future hope was equally systematic, and perhaps even more devastating. Babylonian authorities understood that people could endure almost any present suffering if they believed that better times lay ahead, that their children might enjoy freedoms they themselves had been denied, that their sacrifices might contribute to some greater good that would eventually be realized. To eliminate this source of resistance, the Babylonians developed techniques for making the future appear both predetermined and bleak for anyone who opposed their rule. They would spread detailed prophecies about the fate awaiting rebels and their families, predictions that seemed to come true with suspicious frequency. They would describe the technological and military advantages that made Babylonian dominance permanent and unchallengeable, painting resistance not just as futile, but as a form of cosmic impossibility. More subtly, they would restructure economic and social systems in ways that made long-term planning extremely difficult for ordinary people. Taxes and obligations would be imposed unpredictably, making it impossible for families to save resources or make investments in their future. Children would be conscripted for various forms of service at arbitrary intervals, preventing parents from making educational or career plans for their offspring. The cumulative effect of these policies was to trap people in a state of perpetual crisis management, where all energy had to be devoted to surviving immediate challenges, with no capacity left for considering long-term goals or possibilities. People learned to think only in terms of the next day or week, losing the ability to conceive of meaningful change or improvement in their circumstances. This temporal imprisonment was reinforced through architectural and urban planning decisions that served psychological as well as practical purposes. Babylonian city planners deliberately created environments that felt eternal and unchangeable, where massive stone structures seemed to have existed forever and would clearly continue to exist long after any individual lifetime had ended. The scale of these buildings was designed to make human beings feel insignificant and temporary by comparison. When people walked through Babylonian cities, they were constantly reminded of their own mortality and powerlessness relative to the seemingly eternal institutions that governed their lives. The message was clear: empires rise and fall, but Babylon endures. Individuals live and die, but Babylonian authority transcends all temporal limitations. Within these imposing structures, the daily routines of administration were orchestrated to reinforce the same psychological messages. Citizens seeking services or resolution of disputes would be required to navigate complex bureaucratic procedures that could take months or years to complete. They would be shuffled between different offices, required to fill out forms in triplicate, and subjected to seemingly arbitrary delays and requirements, The inefficiency wasn't accidental, but deliberate, designed to teach people that their individual needs and concerns were insignificant compared to the vast machinery of state administration. Citizens learned to approach bureaucratic institutions with an attitude of humble supplication rather than rightful expectation, understanding that their requests would be granted not as a matter of justice, but as acts of institutional generosity that could be withdrawn at any moment. The psychological impact of this temporal warfare extended into the most intimate aspects of personal life. Families found it increasingly difficult to maintain traditions or pass down meaningful cultural knowledge to their children, when the frameworks that had previously given such transmission significance had been systematically undermined. Parents who had grown up with clear understanding of their heritage and identity found themselves unable to explain to their children why certain customs mattered or what certain symbols meant. The contexts that had made these traditions meaningful had been erased or transformed beyond recognition, leaving only empty forms that seemed arbitrary and pointless to younger generations. Children, sensing their parents' confusion and uncertainty, would naturally gravitate toward the new Babylonian cultural forms that were presented with confidence and clarity in schools and public institutions. They would learn to see their parents' attempts to maintain old traditions as embarrassing evidence of backward thinking, preferring to embrace the sophisticated and apparently successful culture of their conquerors. This generational division served Babylonian interests perfectly, as it prevented the transmission of resistance culture from parents to children, while creating internal family conflicts that absorbed energy that might otherwise have been directed toward opposition to foreign rule. Children became unwitting agents of cultural destruction, gradually convincing their own parents to abandon traditions that suddenly seemed outdated and irrelevant. The erosion of temporal continuity also affected people's relationship with death and spiritual meaning. Traditional beliefs about afterlife and ancestor worship required a sense of connection across time, an understanding that the living and the dead remained linked through continuing cultural practices and shared values. When these cultural practices were suppressed or transformed, the connection to deceased ancestors became increasingly tenuous. People began to feel that their ancestors' struggles and sacrifices had been meaningless, that the world those ancestors had known was so different from the present reality that their experiences offered no relevant guidance for contemporary challenges. This spiritual disconnection created a form of existential despair that made people more susceptible to Babylonian religious offerings. When traditional sources of meaning had been systematically undermined, the elaborate theological systems provided by Babylonian priests could seem like welcome relief from confusion and uncertainty, even if those systems ultimately served to justify continued oppression. The priests understood this vulnerability and exploited it skillfully, presenting their religious teachings not as foreign impositions, but as higher forms of truth that transcended the limitations of local traditions. They would acknowledge the value of certain traditional beliefs, while explaining how Babylonian theology provided a more complete and sophisticated understanding of the same spiritual realities. This approach allowed people to maintain some sense of continuity with their past, while gradually accepting fundamental changes in their worldview. They could tell themselves that they weren't abandoning their ancestors' faith, but rather discovering deeper truths that their ancestors would have embraced if they had possessed access to Babylonian wisdom. The long-term consequences of this temporal warfare were perhaps more devastating than any military conquest could have achieved. Entire populations became trapped in an eternal present, where neither past achievements nor future possibilities could provide psychological resources for resistance. They learned to accept their circumstances not just as unavoidable, but as the natural order of things, the way reality had always been and would always continue to be. This acceptance wasn't the result of any single dramatic conversion, but rather the cumulative effect of countless small surrenders, tiny daily compromises that gradually eroded people's capacity to imagine alternatives to their current situation. Each generation became a little more thoroughly adapted to Babylonian rule, a little less capable of conceiving of independence as a meaningful possibility. The techniques pioneered by the Babylonians for this form of temporal conquest would be refined and adapted by countless subsequent empires, each adding their own innovations while preserving the core insight that controlling people's relationship with time is one of the most effective methods for achieving lasting dominance. The ability to make subjects forget their past and despair of their future has remained a fundamental tool of oppressive authority throughout human history. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Babylonian temporal warfare was how it could make victims complicit in their own temporal imprisonment. People would learn to police their own memories, suppressing thoughts about pre-conquest life that seemed dangerous or irrelevant. They would discourage their children from asking questions about family history that might lead to uncomfortable political implications. They would actively participate in the destruction of their own cultural heritage, convinced that such destruction was necessary for survival and prosperity. This self-imposed temporal blindness created a form of psychological protection against the pain of recognizing how much had been lost, but it also ensured that the losses would become permanent. When people stopped remembering what freedom had felt like, they lost the capacity to recognize their current condition as slavery. When they ceased to imagine better futures, they eliminated the motivation that might have driven them toward resistance or reform. The genius of this system lay in how it transformed the natural human capacity for adaptation from a survival mechanism into an instrument of permanent subjugation. The same psychological flexibility that allows humans to endure temporary hardships and adjust to changing circumstances became a trap that prevented them from recognizing when adaptation had become capitulation, when temporary endurance had become permanent acceptance of the unacceptable. As we contemplate these revelations about Babylonian temporal manipulation, we begin to understand why this ancient empire inspired such lasting terror in those who encountered it. The Babylonians had discovered how to attack not just bodies or even minds, but the fundamental human experience of existing in time itself. They could make people forget who they had been and despair of who they might become, trapping them in a perpetual present where resistance seemed not just dangerous, but literally inconceivable. This mastery of temporal warfare was perhaps their most sophisticated and enduring achievement, a form of conquest so subtle and comprehensive that its victims often never realized they had been conquered at all. They would live their entire lives believing they were free while being more thoroughly enslaved than any physical captive, bound not by chains of iron, but by the invisible fetters of temporal disconnection that made meaningful resistance psychologically impossible. Yet even as we recognize the horror of these techniques, we must also acknowledge their lasting influence on human civilization. The methods pioneered by ancient Babylon for controlling human perception of time continue to shape political and social institutions to this day, refined by modern technology, but fundamentally unchanged in their essential nature. Understanding these patterns, recognizing how temporal manipulation works, becomes a form of psychological archaeology that can help us identify and resist such techniques when we encounter them in our own times. For the tools of temporal warfare did not disappear with ancient Babylon. They merely evolved, waiting to be rediscovered by any authority clever enough to understand their power and ruthless enough to employ them. The night deepens around us, dear listener, and in that gathering darkness we can almost hear the whispers of those ancient voices, the ghostly echoes of civilizations that were not just conquered, but temporarily erased, their very existence in time systematically deleted from human memory. These were not merely military defeats, but ontological catastrophes the complete erasure of entire ways of being human from the historical record. And yet, in recognizing these patterns, in understanding how such temporal violence was achieved, we honor the memory of those lost civilizations and arm ourselves against the possibility that such techniques might be employed again. For the greatest victory against temporal warfare is simply remembering that it exists, maintaining our capacity to recognize when our own relationship with time is being manipulated, and preserving our connection to both past and future as sources of strength and resistance. The story of Babylon's temporal terror serves as both warning and guide, showing us how quickly and completely human beings can be severed from their moorings in time, and how essential it is to guard against such severance if we wish to remain truly human. In understanding how the Babylonians achieved their dominance over time itself, we gain tools for protecting our own temporal integrity and ensuring that the lessons of the past remain available to guide us toward a future that serves human flourishing rather than human subjugation. Rest now in the knowledge that time itself, for all its apparent fragility, possesses a resilience that even the most sophisticated temporal warfare cannot entirely destroy. Truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at erasure, and human memory, though vulnerable, carries within it seeds of resistance that can sprout even in the most barren soil of oppression. Sleep well, knowing that we have only begun to explore the full depths of Babylon's dark legacy, and that greater revelations await us in the shadows still to come. As the darkness of night settles more deeply around us, we must turn our attention to perhaps the most disturbing chapter in Babylon's long catalogue of terrors: their systematic approach to what we might call the industrialization of suffering. For while other ancient civilizations certainly inflicted pain upon their enemies and subjects, the Babylonians were unique in their methodical, almost scientific approach to maximizing human anguish for both practical and psychological purposes. This wasn't mere sadism or the casual cruelty that marked so many ancient societies. Rather, it was a carefully calculated system designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously: to extract information, to break resistance, to provide public entertainment, to satisfy religious requirements, and perhaps most importantly, to create a climate of terror so pervasive that the mere possibility of experiencing such treatment would paralyze entire populations into compliance. The Babylonians understood that pain, properly applied, could serve as both punishment and education, both deterrent and spectacle. They developed what amounted to an entire science of suffering, with specialists who devoted their lives to perfecting techniques that could keep victims alive and conscious for extended periods, while subjecting them to precisely calibrated levels of agony. These specialists weren't crude torturers working in dungeon shadows, but respected professionals who held positions of honor in Babylonian society. They studied anatomy and physiology with the dedication of physicians, learning exactly how much damage the human body could sustain without losing consciousness or dying. They understood pressure points and nerve pathways, circulation patterns and respiratory functions, all in service of their grim craft. The training for these positions began in childhood, with promising candidates selected based on their demonstrated ability to remain emotionally detached while inflicting pain on animals and eventually on human subjects. These children were educated not just in the physical techniques of their trade, but in the psychological principles that made their work effective. They learned to read the subtle signs of mental breakdown, to recognize when a subject was approaching the point of complete psychological collapse, and to calibrate their methods accordingly. Sometimes the goal was to push victims past that point of breakdown as quickly as possible. Other times, the objective was to keep them balanced precisely on the edge of madness for days or weeks at a time. The most skilled practitioners could allegedly keep a subject in a state of exquisite agony for months, carefully managing their physical condition to prevent death. while ensuring that their mental suffering never diminished. These masters of pain were revered almost like artists, their techniques passed down through generations of apprentices who competed for the privilege of learning their secrets. The physical locations where this suffering was inflicted were designed with the same careful attention to psychological detail that characterized all aspects of Babylonian social engineering. These weren't hidden chambers tucked away in the bowels of palaces, but prominent public spaces where the sounds and sights of torture would be visible and audible to large portions of the population. The architecture of these torture amphitheaters was specifically designed to amplify sound, ensuring that the screams of victims would carry throughout the surrounding neighborhoods. Citizens going about their daily business would be constantly reminded of what awaited those who displeased the authorities, creating a background soundtrack of terror that made resistance seem unthinkably dangerous. But the true genius of the Babylonian approach lay in how they transformed torture from a merely punitive measure into a form of public education. Citizens weren't just permitted to witness these spectacles, they were required to attend, and their reactions were carefully monitored by officials who took note of anyone who seemed insufficiently enthusiastic about the proceedings. Children were brought to these events as part of their civic education, taught to view the suffering of others as both entertainment and moral instruction. They learned to cheer for particularly creative torments and to express appropriate disgust for the crimes that had supposedly necessitated such punishment. Those who showed signs of sympathy for the victims were marked for special attention, their families subjected to increased surveillance and their own loyalty called into question. The psychological impact of these mandatory attendance requirements extended far beyond the immediate trauma of witnessing extreme violence. Citizens learned to perform enthusiasm for cruelty, even when they felt revulsion, training themselves to display emotions they didn't feel while suppressing their genuine reactions. This constant performance of false sentiment created a kind of moral schizophrenia that made authentic emotional responses increasingly difficult to access or express. Over time, many people found that the boundary between performed and genuine emotion began to blur. Those who had initially attended torture sessions with hidden disgust would gradually find themselves becoming genuinely excited by the spectacles, their moral sensibilities eroded by constant exposure and social pressure to appear enthusiastic. The selection of victims for these public torments followed patterns that served multiple psychological functions. Sometimes the condemned would be genuine criminals whose offenses had genuinely outraged the community, allowing citizens to feel that their enthusiasm for punishment was morally justified. Other times, the victims would be political prisoners whose only crime was opposition to Babylonian rule, but whose alleged offenses would be presented in ways that made them seem deserving of extreme punishment. Most insidiously, some victims would be chosen essentially at random from the general population, their supposed crimes fabricated entirely for the purpose of maintaining the public spectacle. These arbitrary selections served to remind everyone that safety lay not in innocence, but in absolute compliance with authority, that anyone could find themselves in the torture amphitheater regardless of their actual behavior. The randomness wasn't truly random, of course. The victims were carefully selected to represent different segments of society, ensuring that no group could feel entirely safe from the possibility of selection. Merchants, farmers, artisans, priests, scholars, representatives from every social class would occasionally find themselves chosen for public torment, their suffering serving as a reminder to their peers that no amount of wealth, education, or social status could provide complete protection from state violence. The specific methods employed in these public tortures were designed to maximize both physical pain and psychological impact on spectators. The Babylonians developed elaborate devices that could slowly dismember victims while keeping them conscious and vocal, ensuring that their suffering would be both visible and audible to the crowd. They perfected techniques for flaying that could remove skin in carefully planned patterns, creating designs that were both artistically impressive and maximally painful. They learned to manipulate the human nervous system in ways that could cause excruciating pain without immediately fatal damage, sometimes keeping victims alive and suffering for days, while their torment provided ongoing entertainment for the public. Perhaps most horrifying of all, they developed methods for involving the victims' families in their suffering. Children would be forced to participate in torturing their parents. Spouses would be required to inflict pain on each other. And parents would be made to choose which of their children would suffer more severe punishments. These family participation requirements served multiple functions. They maximized the psychological trauma for all involved. They created guilt and shame that would last for generations. And they demonstrated the complete powerlessness of family bonds in the face of state authority. The religious dimensions of these torture spectacles added another layer of horror to the proceedings. Babylonian priests would provide theological justification for each torment, explaining how the victim's suffering served cosmic purposes that transcended mere human justice. They would describe how pain purified the soul, how screams pleased the gods, and how witnessing such suffering was itself a form of religious observance that brought viewers closer to divine truth. These religious interpretations weren't mere post hoc rationalizations, but integral parts of the torture process itself. Victims would be told that their pain was sacred, that their suffering was contributing to the maintenance of cosmic order, and that their screams were prayers that helped hold the universe together. Some victims, broken by prolonged agony and desperate for any meaning that might make their torment bearable, would actually come to believe these explanations and would thank their torturers for providing them with opportunities for spiritual advancement. The priests would also provide detailed explanations of how different types of pain corresponded to different spiritual lessons, how various torture techniques address specific moral failings, and how the duration and intensity of suffering reflected the severity of cosmic imbalances that needed to be corrected. These theological frameworks transformed random cruelty into sacred ritual, making participation in torture seem not just permissible, but religiously mandated. The long-term psychological effects of this systematized suffering extended far beyond the immediate victims and spectators. Entire generations grew up in an environment where extreme violence was normalized, where empathy was dangerous, and where the ability to inflict or witness pain without emotional disturbance was considered a mark of spiritual maturity and social sophistication. Children who were repeatedly exposed to these spectacles learned to dissociate from their emotional responses, developing psychological defense mechanisms that protected them from immediate trauma, but also made genuine human connection increasingly difficult. They would grow into adults who struggled to form meaningful relationships, who viewed others primarily as potential threats or tools, and who had internalized the Babylonian understanding that suffering was the natural human condition. The social fabric of Babylonian society became increasingly fractured as trust between individuals eroded under the constant pressure of surveillance and the ever-present possibility of denunciation. Neighbors learned to view each other with suspicion, friends became potential informants, and even family members couldn't be trusted with genuine thoughts or feelings that might be interpreted as disloyal. This breakdown of social cohesion served Babylonian rulers perfectly, as a population that couldn't trust each other could never organize effective resistance. The torture spectacles didn't just punish individual transgressors. They created a social environment where transgression became psychologically almost impossible, where the mere thought of resistance would trigger such intense anxiety that most people would suppress such thoughts before they could fully form. The economic dimensions of this suffering industry also deserve examination, as the Babylonians found ways to make torture profitable as well as politically useful. Wealthy citizens could pay for premium viewing positions at torture spectacles, while vendors sold food and souvenirs to crowds attending these events. The torture amphitheaters became significant sources of revenue for the state, turning human agony into a literally profitable enterprise. Specialized craftsmen developed lucrative careers creating and maintaining torture devices. Their skills in metalworking and engineering finding application in the design of increasingly sophisticated instruments of pain. These artisans took pride in their work, competing to create devices that were both more effective at causing suffering and more impressive to observe in operation. The victims' possessions would be confiscated and sold at public auctions, with the proceeds funding further expansion of the torture infrastructure. Families of the condemned would be required to pay for the privilege of witnessing their loved ones suffering, and in some cases would be charged for the materials and labor involved in their relatives' torment. This commercialization of suffering created economic incentives for authorities to identify more victims, as successful torture spectacles generated significant revenue that could fund other state projects. The system became self-perpetuating, with the profits from human agony providing resources for expanded surveillance and enforcement capabilities that could identify and process even more victims. The international dimensions of Babylonian torture practices also played crucial roles in the empire's foreign policy and diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors and dignitaries would be required to attend torture spectacles as part of their official visits, ensuring that they would return to their home countries with vivid accounts of what awaited nations that opposed Babylonian interests. These diplomatic torture viewings served as a form of international psychological warfare, making clear to foreign rulers that Babylonian threats weren't mere bluster, but backed by demonstrated willingness and ability to inflict unimaginable suffering on anyone who defied their authority. The reputation of Babylonian torture methods spread throughout the known world, making the mere threat of such treatment often sufficient to secure compliance without the need for actual military action. Foreign prisoners captured during military campaigns would be subjected to particularly elaborate torments, specifically designed to be reported back to their home countries by any survivors who might eventually be released or escape. These victims served as living advertisements for Babylonian cruelty, their scarred bodies and traumatized minds providing ongoing testimony to the consequences of resistance. The Babylonians would also offer their torture expertise as a service to allied rulers, sending specialists to help other kingdoms establish their own systems of systematic suffering. These torture consultants would train local personnel in Babylonian methods, while ensuring that the resulting system served Babylonian interests, as well as local political needs. This export of torture technology created networks of shared cruelty that bound various kingdoms together in webs of mutual complicity. Rulers who had adopted Babylonian torture methods found themselves psychologically and politically dependent on continued Babylonian support, as any disruption in their relationship might result in their own populations being subjected to the same techniques they had learned to employ against others. The documentation and preservation of torture techniques also became a significant scholarly enterprise within Babylonian civilization. Scribes would carefully record the details of successful torture sessions, noting which methods proved most effective for different types of victims and different political objectives. These records were maintained in specialized libraries that served as repositories of suffering, archives of agony that could be consulted by future practitioners seeking to refine their techniques. The scholars who maintained these records weren't mere clerks, but respected intellectuals who approached the study of human suffering with the same systematic rigor that others applied to astronomy or mathematics. They developed theoretical frameworks for understanding pain, classification systems for different types of torture, and predictive models for determining which techniques would prove most effective in specific circumstances. These academic approaches to torture elevated cruelty from mere brutality to sophisticated science, providing intellectual justification for practices that might otherwise have been recognized as simple sadism. The scholarly apparatus surrounding torture made it seem respectable, even noble, transforming torturers from crude thugs into learned professionals whose work contributed to the advancement of human knowledge. The artistic dimensions of Babylonian torture culture created another layer of horror that demonstrates the complete integration of suffering into every aspect of their civilization. Talented artists would be commissioned to create paintings and sculptures depicting particularly memorable torture sessions, while poets would compose elaborate verses celebrating the beauty of well-orchestrated agony. These artistic works weren't hidden away in private collections, but displayed prominently in public spaces, serving as constant reminders of state power, while simultaneously normalizing extreme violence as a legitimate subject for aesthetic appreciation. Children would grow up surrounded by beautiful depictions of human suffering, learning to associate pain with artistic achievement and moral instruction. The most skilled artists would compete for the privilege of documenting royal torture sessions, their works serving as official records of the monarch's justice, while also providing lasting monuments to the victims' suffering. These artistic torture documents would be preserved in palace collections and occasionally displayed during important state ceremonies, ensuring that the memory of particular punishments would endure long after the original victims had been forgotten. Musicians would compose special pieces to accompany torture spectacles, their compositions designed to enhance the emotional impact of the proceedings, while also providing auditory cues that would help audiences know when to cheer, when to express horror, and when to maintain respectful silence. These musical accompaniments transformed torture sessions into carefully orchestrated performances that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. The integration of suffering into Babylonian artistic culture created feedback loops that made cruelty increasingly sophisticated and aesthetically refined. Artists competing to create more beautiful depictions of torture would inspire torturers to develop more visually striking techniques, while torturers seeking to create more impressive spectacles would collaborate with artists to design sessions that would translate effectively into lasting artistic works. This artistic elevation of torture served to legitimize and perpetuate the practice by making it seem culturally valuable rather than merely politically expedient. Citizens could tell themselves that they were attending sophisticated cultural events rather than primitive displays of violence, allowing them to maintain their self-image as civilized people while participating in systematic cruelty. The educational systems of Babylon incorporated torture appreciation as a standard part of the curriculum, with students required to analyze famous torture sessions from historical, artistic, and theological perspectives. They would write essays comparing different torture techniques, create artistic works inspired by particularly memorable spectacles, and demonstrate their understanding of the religious significance of various forms of suffering. These educational requirements ensured that each new generation would be thoroughly indoctrinated into the cultural norms surrounding torture, making it virtually impossible for alternative moral frameworks to develop or survive. Students learned to approach human suffering with analytical detachment, viewing pain as raw material for intellectual and artistic exploration, rather than as a moral problem requiring compassionate response. The most promising students would be selected for advanced training in torture theory and practice, their education preparing them for careers in the expanding infrastructure of systematic suffering that characterized mature Babylonian civilization. These elite torture students would study with master practitioners, learning not just techniques, but the philosophical and theological principles that justified their application. The psychological profiles of individuals who thrived in this educational environment reveal disturbing patterns that would be replicated in torture cultures throughout history. These successful students typically displayed high intelligence combined with emotional detachment, analytical thinking paired with moral flexibility, and aesthetic appreciation coupled with empathetic deficit. But perhaps most chilling of all was how normal and well-adjusted these individuals appeared in their daily lives. They weren't obvious psychopaths or social misfits, but often charming, intelligent, cultured people who could discuss literature and philosophy with genuine sophistication while also planning elaborate torments for political prisoners. This normalization of torture practitioners served important social functions by making the system seem less threatening to ordinary citizens. If torturers were obviously monstrous, their very existence might have prompted uncomfortable questions about the nature of the society that employed them. But when torturers appeared to be ordinary, even admirable citizens, their activities seemed less morally problematic and more socially acceptable. The families of torture specialists often took pride in their relatives' professional achievements, viewing their work as valuable public service that contributed to social stability and moral order. Children would grow up aspiring to follow in their parents' footsteps, seeing torture specialization as a respectable career path that offered both social status and economic security. This familial acceptance of torture as legitimate profession created dynasties of suffering specialists. With techniques and theoretical knowledge passed down through generations of practitioners, these torture families would intermarry with other elite families, creating social networks that normalized and perpetuated the practice, while also ensuring that resistance to torture culture would be virtually impossible to organize or sustain. The legacy of Babylonian torture culture extended far beyond the empire's own borders and historical existence, providing templates and techniques that would be adopted and adapted by countless subsequent civilizations. The systematic approaches to suffering pioneered in ancient Babylon can be traced through Persian, Greek, Roman, and medieval European cultures, each adding their own innovations while preserving the core insights about the political utility of organized cruelty. Modern totalitarian movements have drawn extensively on Babylonian precedents, updating ancient techniques with contemporary technology while maintaining the fundamental understanding that systematic torture serves multiple functions simultaneously: punishment, deterrence, information extraction, social control, and psychological warfare. The academic study of torture methods, the integration of suffering into cultural and artistic life, the normalization of cruelty through religious justification, the commercialization of pain, the use of torture as diplomatic tool, the involvement of families in their own destruction. All of these innovations pioneered by the Babylonians continue to appear in modern contexts, testament to the enduring power and versatility of their contributions to the dark arts of human domination. But perhaps the most lasting and troubling legacy of Babylonian torture culture lies in how it demonstrated the human capacity for moral adaptation, showing how quickly and completely ordinary people can adjust to the presence of systematic cruelty in their society. The Babylonian example reveals that torture doesn't require monsters or psychopaths to operate effectively. It merely requires a social system that provides appropriate incentives and justifications for ordinary people to participate in or tolerate extraordinary cruelty. This insight challenges comfortable assumptions about human nature and moral progress, suggesting that the capacity for systematic cruelty lies dormant within all human societies, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of circumstances, incentives, and ideological justifications. The distance between civilization and barbarism may be far shorter than we prefer to imagine, and the techniques pioneered by ancient Babylon for closing that distance remain as relevant and dangerous today as they were 4,000 years ago. As we drift deeper into these dark waters of ancient memory, let the weight of these revelations settle slowly into your consciousness, like sediment accumulating on the floor of some forgotten archive. Consider how a civilization capable of such sophisticated artistry and intellectual achievement could simultaneously perfect such elaborate systems of human degradation, and ponder what this duality might suggest about the societies we inhabit today. The night grows ever deeper around us, dear listener. and there are still darker chambers in Babylon's legacy waiting to be explored. But for now, let these images of systematized suffering linger in your thoughts, like shadows cast by flickering torchlight. Reminders of how thin the veneer of civilization can become when human ingenuity is applied to the ancient arts of dominance and control. Sleep comes slowly when the mind has been exposed to such revelations, but perhaps that restlessness serves a purpose, keeping us vigilant against the possibility that such systems might emerge again in new forms, wearing modern faces, but animated by the same fundamental understanding of human vulnerability that the Babylonians mastered so thoroughly in their towering city beside the ancient river. Rest brings little peace when confronted with such truths, and our journey through Babylon's shadowed halls has only just begun to reveal the depths of their mastery over human suffering. As sleep eludes us tonight, perhaps it's fitting that we venture into the most closely guarded secrets of this ancient empire, the practices so disturbing that even their own historians dared not record them in detail. We must now examine what the Babylonians themselves called the sacred mathematics of despair, their systematic study of how hope itself could be weaponized, measured, and deployed as an instrument of control more powerful than any army. For the Babylonians understood something that eluded most other ancient civilizations, that the human spirit's capacity for hope was not a weakness to be crushed, but a resource to be harvested and managed like any other valuable commodity. Their approach began with what they termed hope mapping, a sophisticated process of psychological assessment that could determine exactly how much suffering an individual could endure before their spirit broke entirely. But rather than seeking to reach that breaking point, Babylonian specialists learned to maintain their subjects in a carefully calibrated state of almost broken hope, keeping them functional while ensuring they remained completely dependent on their captors for any possibility of relief. The process began with detailed interviews conducted by specially trained priests who presented themselves as sympathetic counselors. These false confessors would spend weeks or even months building trust with their subjects, encouraging them to share their deepest fears, their most precious memories, their most cherished dreams. Every detail would be meticulously recorded, creating psychological profiles of unprecedented depth and accuracy. Once these emotional maps were complete, the real work would begin. Subjects would be placed in situations carefully designed to exploit their specific vulnerabilities, while simultaneously offering tantalizing hints that relief might be possible. A prisoner who had revealed deep love for his children might be told that their safety depended on his cooperation, while being shown just enough evidence of their well-being to keep hope alive. A captive who had spoken of religious faith might be offered opportunities for worship that were then withdrawn at crucial moments, creating cycles of spiritual ecstasy and despair. The timing of these hope and despair cycles was calibrated with mathematical precision. Babylonian specialists had discovered that the human psyche could be conditioned like any other biological system, trained to respond predictably to specific stimuli. They developed elaborate charts and formulas that predicted exactly when a subject would be most vulnerable to suggestion, when hope should be offered, and when it should be withdrawn for maximum psychological impact. Perhaps most disturbing of all, they learned that this conditioning could be made permanent through a process they called hope scarring. Subjects who survived their carefully orchestrated psychological torture would carry invisible wounds that made them perpetually vulnerable to reactivation of their trained responses. Years or even decades later, specific triggers could instantly return these survivors to their conditioned state of helpless dependency, making them ideal agents for spreading Babylonian influence throughout populations that had never been directly conquered. The applications of this hope manipulation extended far beyond individual prisoners. Entire communities could be subjected to collective hope conditioning through carefully orchestrated cycles of apparent prosperity and deliberate crisis. The Babylonians would arrange for a conquered city to experience a period of relative peace and rebuilding, allowing the population to begin believing that their situation was improving. Then, just as hope began to solidify into genuine optimism, some manufactured crisis would destroy their progress, plunging them back into despair. These community-wide hope cycles could be maintained for generations, creating populations that lived in perpetual psychological bondage, even when they appeared to be free. Citizens would learn to fear their own optimism, understanding unconsciously that any improvement in their situation was merely the setup for an even more devastating fall. This internalized hopelessness made resistance impossible, as people became too afraid of losing what little they had to risk fighting for something better. The religious dimensions of hope manipulation were perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this entire system. Babylonian priests developed elaborate theological frameworks that portrayed hope itself as a form of spiritual pride that needed to be purged through suffering. They taught that true wisdom came only through the complete abandonment of personal desires and the absolute surrender of individual will to divine authority as interpreted by Babylonian religious institutions. These teachings weren't presented as foreign impositions, but as profound spiritual insights that transcended the limitations of local religious traditions. Conquered peoples were told that their ancestors' faiths had been incomplete, lacking the sophisticated understanding of hope's spiritual dangers that Babylonian theology provided. By accepting these new teachings, they weren't betraying their heritage, but fulfilling its highest potential. The priests would use the population's own sacred texts and traditions as weapons against them, reinterpreting familiar stories and symbols to support Babylonian theological claims. They would find passages in local scriptures that seemed to validate the idea that hope was spiritually dangerous, then use these discoveries to convince people that their own ancestors had actually been Proto-Babylonians who had simply lacked the vocabulary to express their true insights. This theological colonization was so thorough that many conquered peoples eventually came to believe that their pre-conquest religious practices had been not just inferior, but actually sinful. They would feel genuine gratitude toward their Babylonian liberators for freeing them from the spiritual errors of their ancestors, and would work zealously to convert any remaining traditionalists who hadn't yet accepted the new theological framework. The economic applications of hope manipulation created perhaps the most enduring aspects of Babylonian influence. They developed sophisticated systems of debt and obligation that could trap entire families in cycles of dependency that lasted for generations. These weren't simple loans, but complex arrangements that created perpetual indebtedness while maintaining the illusion that freedom was always theoretically possible. A farmer might borrow seed grain during a difficult season, only to discover that the repayment terms included not just the original amount, but escalating interest rates and additional fees that made full repayment virtually impossible. However, the contract would always include provisions for partial payments that would reduce the debt slightly, creating the impression that eventual freedom was achievable through sufficient effort and sacrifice. These partial payments would be timed to coincide with seasonal cycles that gave debtors just enough success to maintain hope while ensuring they could never quite achieve complete freedom. The psychological effect was devastating. Families would work themselves to exhaustion, pursuing a goal that remained forever just out of reach, while simultaneously feeling grateful for the opportunity to make progress toward their liberation. The most insidious aspect of these debt systems was how they corrupted family relationships and community bonds. Parents would sacrifice their children's welfare to make debt payments, convincing themselves that this suffering was temporary and would eventually lead to freedom for the next generation. Children would grow up understanding that their family's survival depended on maintaining the approval of Babylonian creditors, creating multi-generational cycles of psychological dependency. Communities would be divided against themselves as families competed for the favor of Babylonian administrators who controlled access to credit and opportunities for partial debt reduction. Neighbors who had once supported each other through difficult times would become rivals, each family secretly hoping that others would fail so that more opportunities might become available for themselves. The Babylonians also perfected techniques for what they called hope laundering, the process of taking authentic sources of meaning and purpose from conquered cultures and transforming them into instruments of Babylonian control. Traditional festivals would be preserved but modified, maintaining their familiar forms while subtly altering their content to support Babylonian values and objectives. A harvest celebration that had once honored local agricultural deities and reinforced community bonds would be gradually transformed into an occasion for thanking Babylonian authorities for their benevolent administration. The songs, dances, and rituals would remain recognizably traditional, but their meanings would be slowly altered until they served entirely different purposes. These cultural transformations were so gradual that most people never noticed what was happening. Each individual change would seem minor and reasonable, perhaps even an improvement over previous practices. Only after years or decades would the cumulative effect become apparent, by which time the original culture had been so thoroughly transformed that few people could even remember what it had been like before Babylonian influence. The psychological impact of this cultural hope laundering was perhaps more devastating than outright cultural destruction would have been. People who had their traditions completely eliminated could at least maintain the dignity of remembering what they had lost. But those whose traditions were gradually corrupted from within experienced a form of cultural dementia, losing their connection to their heritage so slowly that they never quite realized it was happening. The educational systems that emerged from these hope manipulation techniques created perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Babylonian psychological innovation. Children would be taught not just specific subjects, but comprehensive worldviews that made resistance to Babylonian authority psychologically impossible to conceive. These weren't crude indoctrination programs, but sophisticated educational experiences that appeared to encourage critical thinking, while actually training students to think only within carefully prescribed boundaries. Students would learn to question everything except the fundamental assumptions that supported Babylonian power, developing analytical skills that made them more effective servants of the system rather than potential critics of it. The most promising students would be selected for advanced training that would gradually reveal deeper layers of the hope manipulation system itself. They would learn how to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities in others, how to design and implement community-wide conditioning programs, and how to maintain the illusion of freedom while ensuring complete psychological control. These elite students would emerge from their training as willing participants in their own oppression, convinced that their role in maintaining Babylonian psychological dominance was not just necessary, but noble. They would see themselves as guardians of social stability, protectors of cosmic order, and servants of divine will, never recognizing that they had become instruments of the very system that had destroyed their capacity for authentic thought and feeling. The long-term effects of these educational programs extended far beyond the immediate graduates. These psychologically conditioned individuals would become teachers, administrators, and community leaders who would unconsciously perpetuate Babylonian psychological techniques throughout their societies. They would raise children according to principles that seemed natural and beneficial, but actually served to prepare the next generation for even more complete psychological subjugation. The artistic and literary productions that emerged from hope-manipulated populations revealed the profound spiritual damage that these techniques could inflict. Poetry that had once celebrated human dignity and resistance to oppression would be gradually replaced by works that portrayed submission as wisdom and suffering as spiritual advancement. Stories that had once inspired courage and independence would give way to narratives that taught the futility of resistance and the beauty of surrender. These cultural productions weren't created by Babylonian propagandists, but by genuine artists from conquered populations who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they sincerely believed their new artistic visions represented spiritual and aesthetic progress. They would feel contempt for the crude and primitive works of their ancestors, proud of their own sophistication, and grateful for the Babylonian influences that had elevated their understanding. The most talented of these conditioned artists would create works of genuine beauty and power that served Babylonian interests more effectively than any crude propaganda could have done. Their authentic emotional investment in their corrupted artistic visions would give their works a compelling quality that could convert others to Babylonian psychological frameworks more effectively than direct coercion ever could. The medical and healing practices that developed within hope-manipulated populations represented perhaps the most complete inversion of human values that Babylonian techniques could achieve. Healers who had once dedicated their lives to relieving suffering would gradually learn to see certain forms of pain as spiritually beneficial, certain types of illness as divine punishment that shouldn't be treated, and certain categories of patients as unworthy of healing because their suffering served cosmic purposes. These medical practitioners would maintain their sincere desire to help their patients while simultaneously participating in systems that caused tremendous harm. They would develop elaborate theoretical frameworks that allowed them to see their selective application of healing as a form of higher compassion that took into account spiritual as well as physical well-being. The most sophisticated of these corrupted healers would learn to use their medical knowledge to enhance rather than relieve suffering, developing techniques that could prolong illness or intensify pain while maintaining the appearance of therapeutic intervention. They would convince themselves that this was a form of spiritual surgery, cutting away disease aspects of their patients' souls, even if it required damaging their bodies. The family structures that emerged from hope manipulation represented perhaps the most personally devastating aspect of these techniques. Children would learn to see their parents' love as a form of spiritual weakness that needed to be overcome, while parents would be convinced that truly loving their children required preparing them for lives of productive suffering under Babylonian authority. Marriages would be transformed from partnerships based on mutual support into training grounds for psychological submission, with spouses learning to see emotional intimacy as a dangerous indulgence that distracted from their duties to the larger social order. Sexual relationships would become exercises in dominance and submission that mirrored and reinforced the broader patterns of Babylonian political control. The most thoroughly conditioned families would take pride in their emotional dysfunction, seeing their inability to form genuine human connections as evidence of their spiritual advancement. They would compete with other families to demonstrate their superior level of psychological submission, viewing emotional pain as a mark of distinction rather than a sign of damage. The technological innovations that emerged from hope-manipulated populations often represented remarkable achievements that served deeply destructive purposes. Engineers and craftsmen who had been psychologically conditioned would apply their skills to creating ever more sophisticated tools for surveillance, control, and manipulation, genuinely believing that their work contributed to human flourishing. These technological advances weren't crude weapons or obvious instruments of oppression, but subtle systems that could monitor and influence human behavior without their targets being aware of what was happening. The inventors would take pride in the elegance and effectiveness of their creations, seeing themselves as benefactors of humanity rather than architects of its enslavement. The most gifted of these technologically skilled individuals would develop innovations that could extend Babylonian influence across vast distances and time periods, creating systems that would continue to function long after the original designers had died. Their technological legacy would outlast the political empire that had inspired it, spreading Babylonian psychological techniques throughout future civilizations that might never even realize where these methods had originated. As we contemplate these revelations about Babylon's mastery of hope manipulation, we begin to understand why this ancient empire inspired such lasting terror in all who encountered it. They had discovered how to attack not just the body or mind, but the very essence of what makes existence bearable, the human capacity to believe that suffering might be temporary and that better days might lie ahead. By transforming hope itself into an instrument of control, the Babylonians achieved a form of dominance so complete that their victims often never realized they were being oppressed. They created systems of psychological slavery so sophisticated that the enslaved would defend their chains, so subtle that resistance became literally unthinkable, so comprehensive that freedom itself became a concept their subjects could no longer understand. The techniques they pioneered for this manipulation of hope continue to influence human civilization to this day, refined by modern psychology and technology, but fundamentally unchanged in their essential nature. Understanding these patterns, recognizing how hope can be weaponized against those who possess it, becomes a crucial form of psychological self-defense in any age when human freedom faces systematic threats. But perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from studying Babylonian hope manipulation is the recognition that hope itself, despite its vulnerability to exploitation, remains the fundamental source of human resilience. The very fact that hope is powerful enough to be worth manipulating testifies to its essential role in human nature and its ultimate indestructibility. Even the most sophisticated psychological techniques cannot entirely extinguish the human capacity for hope. They can only redirect it, corrupt it, or temporarily suppress it. And in understanding how hope has been attacked in the past, we gain tools for protecting and nurturing it in the present, ensuring that this most precious of human qualities can continue to serve its authentic purpose of inspiring resistance to oppression rather than submission to it. The darkness deepens around us now, dear listener, as we approach the very heart of Babylon's legacy of terror. But in that darkness, perhaps we can begin to discern the faint glimmers of light that no amount of systematic manipulation has ever been able to completely extinguish. The eternal human capacity to hope for something better, to dream of freedom, and to find meaning in the struggle against those who would make us less than human. Rest now in the knowledge that hope, for all its fragility, possesses a stubborn resilience that has outlasted every empire that has tried to destroy it. Sleep well, knowing that the very fact that we can recognize and understand these ancient techniques of psychological domination is itself a form of hope, proof that the human spirit retains its capacity to learn, to resist, and ultimately to triumph over even the most sophisticated attempts to enslave it.